cannot run after people. So, yeah, I will disconnect. Yeah, a bit more, but I think it's on it's then then we can start when you want, Alexandra, and kind of weird. That's the first one I do with. Okay.
Hello? Hello? No.
Perspectives and stances are, and but outside in the scientific.
Hello? Oh, great.
And if you want, you can click.
Oh,
Oh, I can do it.
yeah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce you to this side event here at COP27 on accelerating global and national deep decarbonization and the role in particular of company transition plans. As you know, the Paris Agreement really is an agreement among parties, but of course established the role of non-state actors and in part also companies as essential actors in reaching the temperature goal that we're here to work on. And so since the Paris Agreement, there are many non-state actors and companies and the financial sector have committed to net zero goals and to reduce their emissions, but there has also been a lot of concerns around greenwashing. And in particular at COP26, Antonio Guterres really insisted on the need for accountability and integrity in these plans. And as we all know, a week ago, the UN high-level expert group that he had commissioned for net zero integrity of non-state actor commitments published a report in which one of the 10 recommendations is that companies set out detailed transition plans. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I will just basically briefly introduce how the panel is going to go. So first we will have an welcoming words by Stéphanie Bouzig-Eschmann, who's the executive director for the French Facility for Global Environment. Then we will have a keynote presentation from Yann Briand, who's a research fellow at IDRI, and then a panel discussion with our three panelists here that I will introduce afterwards. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody. I will be quick on this one because I think you know all the FFEM, but for those of you who may not know or be too much familiar with this, this instrument, this is a public financial instrument created by the French government in 1994 after the Rio Earth Summit. And we finance projects, innovative pilot projects, to reconcile environmental conservation on one side and sustainable development on the other side. So we have always the two aspects involved. The projects we finance provide innovative solutions in the fields of biodiversity, climate change, international waters, land degradation, and even the ozone layer and chemical pollutants. And we also aim at generating environmental, but also social and economic benefits that make a difference at the local level. So we don't finance projects only to finance innovation, but really to seek and disseminate solutions and good practices, new approaches, new methods. And to that end, we support these projects to test the solutions. And then we disseminate the outcomes and the lessons learned. And for 28 years now, we finance more than 400 projects with about 450 million euros in 120 countries. So quite a lot. So why did the FFEM support the ACT-DDPP or the ACT-DDP project? First, it has guided companies as they developed strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and coordinated dialogue between the private sector and national decision makers. Its aim was to minimize the climate impact of high-emitting sectors such as cement, food industry, electricity, land use in Mexico and Brazil. It is conceived as a laboratory for the low-carbon transition in line with the Paris Agreement, as our colleague just mentioned, in these major emerging countries, mixing a bottom-up approach from enterprises strategies with a top-down approach related to the national decarbonization scenario. And that is very innovative. And now, why this side event is so important today? Because we will have the opportunity to share the lessons learned from this project now completed. And what we've I won't I won't spoil all the results, but at least what we can mention is, first, number of private companies are committed for corporate social responsibility matters, for instance, including reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, but they need proper tools and methodologies to operationalize their targets. The outcomes of the projects are therefore very meaningful, and they are publicly available, which is really, really important for us. So they are available on the internet. Also, all decarbonization plan at company level needs to be consistent with national and sectorial decarbonization plan. The ACT-DDP has set a first gateway between these two levels, and that should be reinforced and continued. A strong focus should be given to availability of data in particular. Also, the project has been hindered by the change at national political level, both in Brazil and Mexico, I must say. However, the project has continued despite this adverse change with relay at various levels, sub-federal, regional, from large cities, with the public society and think tanks, and we see it with our panelists that will be later on the stage. And we believe that the work done is at a first step for more ambitious mobilization and appropriation in Brazil and Mexico. We hope that the number of companies and sectors that will use the ACT-DDP tools and methodologies will continue to raise thanks to your engagement, you Brazilian and Mexican partners engaged in the project. And we also hope that the project could inspire other countries in Latin or Central America or even elsewhere. And finally, I must say that this project has required a very high level of commitment and coordination between all stakeholders. And the COVID-19 crisis was really, really a huge mess for everybody in the world, obviously, but for the project in particular. And it made this exercise of coordination all the more difficult. So I would like to take this opportunity to really thank all the partners of the project to have been able to go through this period with enthusiasm, and it's really because you were so involved and so committed to this project that you made it happen. So for that reason, really, really thank you. And thank you for presenting us the results now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. And indeed, I mean, that's a very welcoming words. Also introducing the project that actually, in my presentation, I will extract only some of the key lessons. So, and you provided also the big picture that is perfectly linked to that. So the title of my presentation is actually also to see the lessons from this experimentation, what we could learn to also reply to the, let's say, the point that Alexandra made at the beginning regarding the integrity of the corporate transition plan. So actually I will not detail that much, for example, the pathways at the national level of Brazil and Mexico, but I will try to extract some lessons that could be relevant for actually assessing better corporate transition plans. But before to start, I will present you or just tell you in a word who we are and where we took from. So actually, we did this project, we are working at IDRI within an international network that is a deep decarbonization pathways network that you see on the map here. And that is an international community of practitioners, national practitioners and experts working in their country to develop deep decarbonization pathways that are relevant for their national transition. They know what are the country specificities that they need to include in their pathways and that will make these pathways realistic or not, so to avoid to plug some solutions coming from other places so they adapted to their context. And so I'm working in this initiative, and we launched in this new project, we were partnering with the ACT initiative that is assessing the specificity of the ACT initiatives is the assessment of corporate transition plans. And we were producing analysis on the national deep decarbonization pathways to try to couple these two dimensions. But now let's come back to the topic of actually companies and commitments and stuff like this. So I wanted to start with a few numbers and just a few context in mind. So what you see here on the map are information from the SBT initiative, just that show the rapid ramping up in terms of collaboration. So the total curve represents like all the companies that started an engagement with the SBT initiative, and just in the approved target, you see, I mean, that there are many that are still in approvement, so that are not finished, but it represents 1/3 more or less of the global economy market capitalization. So it is important then to engage also with these stakeholders on the question of, okay, what goes beyond the target? And these targets are important. These are one also of the dimensions and recommendations that the high-level expert group did. But clearly, this is the reports of the targets that have been already approved, and you see half of the target that have been approved, so half of companies with approved target have reported progress, so meaning that only half are really following every year and reporting again on where they are really on meeting this target, so only half. And a quarter at least, and you see 25 did not report at all. So that means that they commit on something, but then the year after they are not reporting anything on where they are really advancing. So that is one of the issue. And the second one is that the targets achieved or that are on track, it represents half, only half, and that we have around a quarter that is really lagging behind when we look at the transition plans and analysis of transition plans that they have tried to do. This is really lagging behind. So these are just key facts that explains why we have a growing concern about the credibility of those targets, and why you express in the introduction, Alexandra, the criticism of greenwashing. So how do we answer to this criticism, and how do we ensure that these commitments are realistic and real? Clearly, we have seen the emergence of what they called, or what we called in the community, the corporate climate transition plans or transition plans, more or less, I could call it from my perspective a DDP corporate. I mean, the objective here. I've just taken a definition. There are many different that differs a bit, but a corporate transition plan is a climate transition plan that is time-bound plan that outlines how the company will align its business model with its decarbonization goal. So clearly, we want to understand how they go there. Point. What we understand from the existing literature on reports on the transition plans is that only 1/3 of all the companies, so that CDP, you know, is an international organization that has a reporting system with companies. Only 1/3 of the company that report to CDP are saying that they do a transition plans. Only 1/3. Then a second challenge around this agenda is the available disclosure. Clearly, and that's something also that you has raised also in your introduction, and that also came out of all our experimentation in Brazil and Mexico, is that clearly this is insufficient. I mean, we are not able to get all the details that we would need really to ensure that indeed they have developed the transition plans with all the dimensions we need, and that is included. I will come back then to the different methods, but that indeed enable us really to assess if they are going in the right direction or not. And I was pointing it here, just here, but it has been reminded in the introduction, but just last week, so sorry I said October 2022, but just last week, the report has been published, so from after 1 year of this UNSG high-level expert group, and they point here, that's the sentence, that clearly they need more detail. One of the recommendations for the companies, if we want to assess their integrity, is to have detailed transition plans. This is not all the report, of course, but this is one part and the one we will discuss and continue to discuss today. Now, so I presented you a bit this, what I said, this emerging agenda. Now the question is about having a clear common system on reporting or discussing these corporate transition plans. And what I understand and I have seen in the literature is that there is no one method yet. I mean, there are many. We have worked with the ACT initiative that has developed a very interesting one with, I was not entering into the detail, but just to show like 9 modules, 27 different underlying indicators and so on. You see that there are other initiatives that try to work on this question of what are actually the different elements we should look at in the transition plans. So I will not, but this is just not an exhaustive list, but you see just here a sample. And what we have again learned from our project was that we use the ACT methodology, as I said. Clearly, with the ACT methodology that is asking, so 9 modules, so many different indicators, we face the challenge to really be able to clearly have all this information. So the information that we could really access, first publicly, was almost impossible, but even then, by discussion, was a kind of hard work that Romain and the ACT initiative team did, but to truly enable and get all the relevant information, that was required with their method. However, and I think we will discuss it also after, but this represents a big risk for company, because we are advancing also in international standards on that discussion. And with this experimentation, and we are not the only one to see that we are lacking of relevant detail that enables to really assess the corporate transition plans. And we see the international standards that are actually already like taken some of the element, for example, of the ACT methodology and so on. I don't know, by 2025 in Europe, when it will come for one of the standard, for example, how they will be able really to reply or really to get the standard. So that's one point. The second point or lessons that is important to recognize is that at the same time, companies were keen to engage with us in the different dialogue space that you explained, Stephanie, and that we created through the project at the regional level, in the city. We invited also the civil society, so we tried to organize a meaningful conversation, and clearly they were keen also to enter into a dialogue with other actors to understand a bit or they understand that clearly they are not alone in their field, and meaning that it requires interaction to understand better how their corporate business plan needs to go in which direction and so on. And now, sorry for this slide, there is a lot of information, but like I want to emphasize 2 points, 2 main lessons of this project. So one is, I call it like what to not miss. What to not miss, because sometimes in all the information we asked to report or to assess, sometimes we miss what's really relevant. So just to give you an example, and I think it's one of the difficulty, when we have some methodologies that are complex with many indicators and different modules or whatever, then indeed that's important to recognize that there is not like one single indicator, that there are many dimensions to look at, but it is also very important to not miss the most, you know, the first level important one. And the risk sometimes when we look systematic or systemic with all the different dimensions is to ensure that in the end we are not discussing, you know, about the small topic where the big elephant in the room is not addressed. So what I want to emphasize here is that clearly in the discussion, so on the left side, we need to move and to be able with companies to move from this discussion about optimizing existing systems, but be able to really discuss how they implement the structural systemic change that will completely transform their business model for some of them. And we need to be able to address it with them. So clearly, on the first point, what is highly relevant from our point of view is to be able to share the visions, their vision, the visions they have of the sectoral transition that depends on their core sector of activity. Meaning to be very concrete for, I don't know, a cement industry, that they talk about the building sector, that they talk not only about how you produce cement, no, what will be the building sector, how this will evolve, and maybe what is the place of cement in this new world and low carbon building world. The same thing to discuss with the agro-food business, or to understand, and we had the opportunity to have discussion because it was one of the sector in Brazil, a big important one, to discuss also in the broader picture of, okay, what is the future of the consumption also of the agricultural products, to understand for a beef producer also the risk of his strategy. So clearly sharing vision about the sectoral transformation in which their core activity is key to discuss potential opportunity of new business market. Just to give an example, like having a beef producer that consider himself as a protein producer rather than just a beef producer change already a bit the picture. And in a way, maybe could see other opportunity of developing his business, just to give one of them. Of course, tackling with this dimension, the transition of their existing assets. If then the vision that is shared on the power system is to say that we need to move out of fossil fuels generation for power, then okay, if you have a coal-fired plant, how do you make the transition of this coal-fired plant? And this should be written, we should understand how this will happen, because it will be necessary. And the last one is of course about the new investment in production assets to ensure that they are not created new stranded assets or new locking situation. So these are core elements that if they are missed, if they are missed, I think we are missing like the elephant in the room. Second aspect that I have found also very relevant to then address a number of other dimensions is making them understand the transition of the other subsystems that are in interaction with their core business. Meaning, for a cement producer or whatever other production system, the logistic and transport system, how the logistic and transport system will evolve. This is important for them to understand the constraint when they are, for example, engaging with their suppliers on this topic. And if they just, and that's what we have seen in other projects, if they are just asking the logistic carriers and the transporter to reduce their emissions, but they don't understand also their challenges to do it because they don't have the solution or because they don't know, it is creating problems. I mean, where they expect that with their supplier they will reduce or cut by 20% or whatever, but they can't do it. So we need also to provide this picture with the companies of, let's say, these systems that are in interaction, the energy system too, of course. So I mentioned like energy system, logistic and transport, packaging, I mean, all these, let's say, elements that are more not their core business most of the time, but that they need also to understand how the transition will happen. And then, sorry. So sharing vision is the first one on these two central elements. And then describing two aspects of what they put in place. And the two aspects are internal levers, of course, and external levers. So I would like to explain that. I think in terms of concrete indicators that we have seen in the ACT methodology and that is relevant for companies is, of course, to talk about investment in terms of CapEx, in terms of R&D investment, to also talk about the different all the different service procurement characteristics, linked to energy, transport, packaging, so all their, in a way, operational expenditures. So to be able to understand what matters for them, I mean, and clearly, from a company point of view, talking about OPEX, CapEx is the way to think about. So meaning like looking about the operational expenditure and how this could be a lever for the discussion or to enable the transition of the transport sector or the others is something that is important as an indicator to understand. And of course, a number of other elements linked to governance and organizational changes within the company. So meaning linked, just for a few examples, linked to incentive for executives or so on, changes in internal production, for example, in processes, I mean in decision processes, KPI, and so on. So clearly these are three key elements in terms of internal levers that they need to report on. We need to know investment, we need to know on the service procurement characteristics, we need to know in terms of governance and organizational changes what they are putting in place to go in that direction. And the second dimension is external levers, meaning of course to recognize that they have also a capacity in public policy engagement and a capacity in engagement with other actors to contribute to reduce their carbon footprint and indirectly themselves or the scope 3 emissions that is in their reporting. So that's our lessons from this experimentation shared with ACT on what matters and what we should not miss. And this is our vision to not be lost maybe in all the different detail as 4 in a way main element to be in. And I will finish this presentation by the last type of lesson that is of course the reconciliation or reconciling corporate and national deep decarbonization plan and why this is a necessity. We will discuss it also I think in the panel discussion after, but clearly this is necessary for two main reasons. The first one is about cooperation, is to recognize that clearly the transition will require a set of different actions that are taken by different actors. So the company themselves will not reach carbon neutrality or will not reach their net zero, whatever, alone. Point. And clearly that at the national level remains one of the key sovereignty perimeter for public policy action. The second dimension is of course about national circumstances. I mean, it's a word that we all use in the climate governance space, but saying that indeed we could not ignore, and companies' plan could not ignore if they say sometimes they are aligned with the Paris Agreement. Being aligned with the Paris Agreement is not only about the goal of the Paris Agreement, the goal in terms of temperature goal, I mean. The dimensions of the common but differentiated responsibility is also a key dimension of being aligned with the Paris Agreement. And for us, clearly, this question, the capacity to integrate or to assess company transition plan based on national scenarios enable us also to address this question of a more fair assessment that respects this common but differentiated responsibility that the Paris Agreement is also recognizing as key in the discussion. then this is the why, but clearly this is also a lot of opportunities for companies. I mean, honestly, and this is what we tried during the project, that we discuss a lot with them to explain them why this makes also a lot of sense for them to engage with us on these national deep decarbonization pathways and to discuss at the sectoral level and so on. The first on cooperation is what I said, clearly they need to understand also the action levers of the other actors, because they will not decarbonize alone, and they will need action from consumers, they will need the action from their suppliers, they will need, so this dimension of understanding the action levers of the others is a key one and an opportunity when we organize the kind of multi-stakeholders dialogue that we have done in the project was also, I mean, a really good opportunity for them. The second point around these national circumstances is clearly that for them this is an opportunity to take a step back from their, let's say, operational issues and challenges, and to understand, take maybe a step back, look at the national level, what are the other sustainable challenges of the country around poverty and development, around the gender challenges. So depending on their core business, sometimes the interaction could be quite high. So, and to get that, clearly talking at the national level and sectoral level of the transition, it facilitates them to get this element and to get this, what we call a kind of systemic perspective of the transition. So, and just to finish, the last point I wanted to mention is that at this stage, the problem is that we don't have clearly, I mean, for companies, they don't develop targets and report their vision at the national and regional level. Regional level sometimes, but most of the time we are, and that's a difficulty, we are talking with companies that are international in nature and that don't have only activities in one country. But clearly for this discussion to happen and to assess also the consistency compared to a national transition plans, we also need to have them work at different regional or more national level than only, let's say, a global reduction target that did not tell us actually what is the part of this reduction. Is that in Europe that it will come, or will that be done with the activities in Brazil or whatever? So this is really a critical point, that today the targets are not nationally defined. I mean, depend on the activity, but for many international companies. And I finish on this point saying that it was, I mean, clearly the two approaches that we combined through this project, we found it relevant as framing tools. So we have been designing, so using these two tools, we have found it quite interesting to facilitate the discussion, but only if we were using it to help them explicit really the content of the underlying transformations. So meaning that we do not stop only at the target definition. And I will stop here, just do a bit of advertising like Stephanie did. I mean, on the website, I mean, on the project, I mean, we have been designing methods, we have been designing pathways at the Brazilian, Mexican level on different subsectors. We have been building assessments of companies that are also published online. So all this content is available at the website that you see here, so actddp.org. So please, if you want to learn more, you can go on this website. Thanks a lot. And I will actually just invite now my three panelists to join on stage. So Paola Linear, thank you for being there. So Paola, the co-chair of the Race to Zero Expert Peer Reviewed Group, and also director of the Avina Foundation. Romain Poivet, so climate engagement lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And Emilio Lebrela Rovere, professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you for joining us today and on stage. I will start with a very simple question. I think it's interesting that you tell us where you come from in a way, so just you tell us a bit what you are doing, what is your main activity currently, and I will start, you are the closest to me, so please let us know a bit about Race to Zero, the Expert Peer Review Group, and also Avina, I mean, so...
Thank you very much, Ian, and everyone. I'm Paola Linear, Brazilian, based in Argentina, but working across Latin America and the Global South. Um, Currently, I'm Director for Climate Action at Fundación Avina. Fundación Avina works for collaboration to sustainable development and a just climate transition in the Global South. And I'm also currently co-chairing the expert peer review group from the Race to Zero. The expert peer review group is an independent group that analyzes the partner initiatives that apply to Race to Zero. We do that when they do the application. Currently there are 26 partner initiatives member to Race to Zero. And we do also follow up annually, reviewing the different initiatives. And we also work on the criteria that run Race to Zero. Currently there are 5 criteria. And this year we did a criteria consultation process where we could discuss further on several aspects of what makes a strong and robust net zero commitment. And one of the aspects we discussed was plan. What makes a robust component of plan in a climate pledge.
Thank you. If I may just start by thanks a lot Jan for his involvement in the ACDDP project, and my former colleague Rocio Caicedo Torrado, who has led the ACDDP project, and FFM and Stephanie especially, because when we proposed this project, like in just after COP22, FFM was the only organization that understood the importance of having transition plans of companies aligned with national sectoral transition plan. So now for everybody it's obvious, because we are now talking about transition plan since last year. So now it's obvious we need to have transition plan. But yeah, 7 years ago it was not obvious for anyone, and only FFM believed in this project. So thanks a lot. So I'm Romain Poivet, I'm Climate Engagement Lead for the World Benchmarking Alliance. I used to develop the ACT methodologies 4 years ago. I used to work for the French State Agency of Ecological Transition. I was part of the working group who revised the criteria for the Race to Zero on transition plan, actually. And just to explain what is the World Benchmarking Alliance, it's an NGO, Dutch NGO, global NGO, that basically provide benchmark, freely available benchmarks that assess the most, let's say, the 2,000 most influential companies against 7 system transformations, from sustainable finance to climate and energy, obviously. And there are already like 270 companies assessed on their transition plans, and those benchmarks are available on the World Benchmarking Alliance website.
Thank you very much. My name is Emilio Lebre La Rovere. I'm Brazilian, and I'm based in Rio de Janeiro, at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where I lecture and lead a research team on energy, environment and climate change issues. And in this project I was responsible for conducting the work in Brazil. That means the national scenarios, the sectoral scenarios in 3 sectors: cement, power generation and beef production supply chain. And well, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my partners here in this project, Idri, Adem, and of course the FFEM in the person of Jan, Roman and Stephanie, for the support. And it was a learning process that I think was very helpful for Brazilian companies, but also for policymakers and the stakeholders involved in the project in different occasions, in spite of the difficulties already mentioned due to COVID, delays and so on. But it was really learning by doing in a new environment, and so we are very happy to be here today and share with you the results and the lessons learned from this project. Thank you.
Thanks to you, and actually I will start with the first question. I think a bit more directed to Romain, but please feel free to come on this. I mentioned the fact that discussions were ongoing related to international standards on corporate transition plans. Romain, I know you are in some group of discussion. I would be glad if you can tell us where the discussions are going currently, either in the European context or international context, and because I think it is an important dimension for companies to understand in the next years.
Thanks. So as we said, now it's obvious that we need some transition plans, and standard developer they have started to develop some new standards and regulation as well. Like you mentioned, the European context, where the European Commission has now released the CSR directive, and basically all companies that have activities in Europe will have to disclose their transition plans according to the EFRAG ESRS standard, starting next year. So there is also the ISSB, which is developed by IFRS, and it's also a new standard that will ask companies to disclose their transition plans. So beyond these two initiatives, there are now the H-leg report. There is the Race to Zero, who increase let's say the level of ambition of the criteria to really be able to capture the transition plans details. And what is really important is to understand that we need to go beyond, as you said, beyond just science-based target. We need to have like medium, and long-term target and short-term target. We need to have all the information related capex in the investment of companies to decarbonize their activities and the assets of production. We need to understand how they invest in R&D. We need to understand how they engage all along their value chain. We need to understand what is the climate governance of the company. We need also to understand how they support publicly, at least, ambitious climate policies. We also need to understand how they will invest in the best technologies and how they will develop new business models that are aligned with the low carbon model. And you mentioned, for instance, cement or stuff like that, but can we imagine that in a close future, for instance, an oil and gas company or an energy company will not only sell energy, but will start to sell energy efficiency services or energy reduction services, maybe. So yeah, basically the world is evolving on transition plans. I think we are now having good basics, and now it's important that companies really start to disclose this information. And I guess we all have noticed the fact that at least in the European context, most of the companies they have started to be really pushing back against the CSR directive and the standard developed by EFRAG, because it's, according to them, too much detail. But we need these details if we really want to make those companies accountable for their climate engagement.
Thanks. I don't know if others want to talk about these oncoming regulations, or if we move. Yeah, you want? Please, Paola.
Just very short in terms of context and reinforcing what you said at the beginning, like the vision of having this research at this moment. What we are seeing at Race to Zero as part of the expert peer review group is that there was a first stage where we worked a lot on having pledges right, and now we hope that almost all of the partners at Race to Zero have their pledges right. It's very important to work on implementation of the other piece, which we call the plan, proceed, publish, and persuade, which is the fifth one, and plan being the first one, right? And yeah, very much in line with what you said. One of the things that we're looking in the interpretation guide as part of a robust plan would be being public and transparent, being published. Many of the companies don't have them published yet, so making it published. but also within the plan, be concrete in terms of governance, how the plan is going to be financed, and as a leadership practice, if it also incorporates factors of aspects of a just transition, investment in nature, how to empower other actors from the value chain. So very much in line with the findings that you shared is what came out from the consultation process.
Sorry. And just if I may, we just need to keep in mind that it's not because we have the best standards for disclosure that we will have better transition plan. Because you can have a perfect disclosure system and still continue to disclose irrelevant or useless information. So then we need to have something that allows to assess those transition plans.
And then it's a good transition. But moving to the second question I had, which was, if you remember, so I had the two last slides. So one was on what to miss, and what are indeed then for you like the type. Even we are not doing the list, the exact list, but like the 2 or 3 type of example of relevant details that will be needed. I put on the table some of them, but I don't know from your experience at the national level, also of engagement with companies. What are the relevant details that we should not miss if we really want to not just say, hey, they have disclosed the transition plans, and then what are the information in these transition plans? So I don't know. From your different experience in Brazil, in Argentina, or more regionally in Latin America and Romain, that you would like to share around this. I don't know who would like to start first, giving a word. Emilio, please.
Yes, in theory, corporate targets could be standalone net zero commitments and say some time bound, but we know that in the real world it's not like that. So particularly to the hard to abate sectors. So first thing is of course transparency, already mentioned, and second, the coverage of emissions. We all know that, well, scope 1 and 2 emissions, the direct emissions in the plants and for energy supply to the companies are very well accounted in most cases. But scope 3, the supply chain, is actually an open-end story. There is no boundaries, and we know that the coverage is very poor generally. So we need to improve that. And I think another third element is a B plan. We all know that in many cases it won't be possible to do in-house reductions to get to net zero. So at least there should be a knowledge, and there should be a strategy for offsetting hard to abate emissions. I think this is absolutely crucial in many cases, in many sectors.
Yeah, just to complement, share very much on the importance of information on the hard to abate sectors, and what if in the case of offsetting, what type of standards and what type of offsetting is being used. Other issues I think I mentioned quickly before, but that we are looking at is having in the plans also defined immediate actions to be taken on 2-3 years, and actions by 2030, so different time frames, and how they align or not to sectorial breakthroughs or national plans and so on. And again, on the governance and finance, so how are the plans going to be operationalized, who's responsible for taking the decisions, the responsibilities, and how it's going to be financed. But I wanted to make a point that is beyond the transitions planned by company themselves. As the EPRG, we're not assessing the companies, but we are looking and analyzing the partners who are engaging with the companies. So different initiatives that are themselves engaging with companies. And so looking at the aggregate, one of the things that comes up often in the discussion regards how do we ensure for criteria of a just transition? So what are the differences that should be included in transition plans and pathways regarding small companies in comparison to big corporations, and companies based in the global south in comparison to companies in the global north? So what should be the differences in terms of transition plans that reflect this discussion on fair share and just transition?
I can just mention the fact that on the just transition aspect, I will only invite you to look at the benchmark developed by WBA, because they really focused also on the just transition aspect. And I'm sad to say that, but basically companies that have been assessed by WBA so far are not doing so good also on just transition. So we need also to have relevant standards, once again, around just transition to be sure that we can, once again, capture the relevant information, and then that we are able to assess the overall consistency. Because even, as I said previously, even if we have a relevant information, we need to be able to assess the overall consistency of the information.
Thanks, and I take from this first question that, I mean, on the climate point, on the climate dimension, what you were saying, Emilio, is also that, I mean, in terms of detail of the emissions that they are reporting, I mean, we also need to open the boxes. I mean, just have like, I don't know, the scope 1 aggregated or so on. So to understand, maybe go at the level of the assets sometimes to really check asset by asset also what it makes sense, which one is creating the most impact and so on. So this is indeed the type of detail that we will need, and that sometimes companies are not keen to share, to be honest. We have seen it, but clearly that's a starting point to go find the relevant level of description that will enable us not to have like aggregated emission, but indeed to then check where it really matters and identify then the different enablers. So I think it's very, very central. And actually, that's a perfect panel, because you transition also by talking about just transition. I think I wanted to make you react also about the last slide or the last information I was discussing, you know, about this indeed fair transition, that when we mention being aligned with the Paris Agreement is also part of identifying different responsibilities and so on, and you mentioned the global north and global south respectively. So I would be glad that you share with us also from your perspective, maybe different from research, from also engagement directly with different stakeholders and so on, the role that you see, or the advantage or disadvantage that you can see of comparing a company based on an international or regional pathway versus a national one, and if you agree or disagree also with what I was presenting, so or adding again element to complement. So I would like to ask Emilio to start as a please.
Yes, reacting to your point, I think everything you mentioned about disaggregation relates to the definition of plan. We don't want just vague policy statements. We need to have the sufficient granularity and resource allocation, allocation of responsibilities. Otherwise, it's not a plan. It's just something, very loosey as a plan. And in terms of the difference between the global south and north, it's very easy. For instance, you start asking about linkages with national plans. In many countries of the South, developing countries, we still don't have national plans. We still don't have national targets. So how can we actually get inspired and aligned with them? We have economy-wide targets that have to be translated into sectoral mitigation plans with sectoral targets, and we all know that that's the politically sensitive question, because it's a burden sharing political discussion at the end of the day. So I think that it's important that this corporate movement puts pressure on government in order to establish. Otherwise, they will always be off the hook, saying, well, we are doing our best. It's now up to the, say, in the case of Brazil, for instance, controlled deforestation should do the rest, removals will do the rest. So we need to have this backcasting exercise back from 2050 up to today, with targets and milestones at the sectoral level, and then this will provide benchmark. Of course, each company is specific, is not the representative of the average of the sector, but at least provides some, say, indication of where the company is, and also the transparency can help to get information from where other companies are, so we can compare that and see how the race is going.
Yeah, I can't agree more on the fact that we need to have sectoral national decarbonization plans. I mean, we can always assess companies at international levels, like using the IEA scenario, for instance, but we all know that the transition will not be the same in Brazil or in France. So if we really want to capture that, we need to have more DDP, basically. I have a dream, it's that we have all the DDP available all around the world to then plug that in tools like ACT in order to be really able to assess the transition, the contribution of the transition of a company at national level, because we need to contextualize the transition. Otherwise, it's, well, my point, I think it's useless. And I can just give the example of what was done in France by ADEME. They developed some sectoral transition plans, starting from the national low carbon strategy, and they did a deep dive study on cement, an old heavy industry, let's say. And for instance, on cement, we know that in France, if we want to reach the national goal, we need to, of course, use all the technologies available, but still, even if we implement like CCS technology for cement, we know that only 20% of the assets are eligible to CCS technologies because of the ground characteristics. So that leads to question also the demand. And do we still need to have cement production in the 2050 world, for instance? And knowing that we will not use all the assets of cement companies, what will be the impact on the worker, for instance? How do you already start to help them to transition to a new job? How do you, and thinking about how do you start to have like some teaching programs to also educate the current students, and how they will work in what kind of job they will have tomorrow? So we need to contextualize the transition.
Yeah, no, I don't have much more to share. Just maybe add at global level that there is, by the Race to Zero, it was developed the sectoral breakthroughs, which also provide some guidelines and information in terms of, but that's an international level, sectoral breakthroughs in the transition. That being said, as part of this discussion of a just transition, it's fundamental to have the national sectorial plans, which, again, I share, it's a big challenge also currently for many countries.
Thank you all for, I mean, all the panelists for the discussion. I will just now stop and pass just the floor for a minute if you want Alexandra to reflect and finish and conclude. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This discussion was really fascinating to me, so thank you, Yen, for inviting me to introduce and conclude. Actually, it did bring me, I work more at the question of net zero integrity at the global scale, and in particular taking into account the fact that we have to address not just the climate crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis. And this means that actually a lot of the IPCC scenarios that over-depend on large-scale carbon dioxide removal from like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or afforestation in the future, and therefore reduce emissions less, are just not viable if we account for the fact that we cannot continue destructing ecosystems. So just going into the more detail of what this means of getting to really deep decarbonization at the level of in countries and in companies was really interesting to me, and it actually gives me a lot of hope after the UN Secretary General's led report last week to do a deep dive into one of the key recommendations. So thank you so much for everyone, and that is it.